You're listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision-making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision-making in your life and business.
So you made an interesting decision this morning. So we were in your office getting ready to come into the studio. And so I've seen people walk into the office with like a bag of donuts or a breakfast burrito wrapped up. And you walked in with your breakfast.
Yes.
And it was a plate, like a real plate of eggs and bacon with a fork, like from a restaurant or at home, which that was, I've never seen somebody walk into an office that way, but that means you had to drive here
with an uncovered plate.
With a plate of food. And that's not how you do that.
Well, I have plates at home.
It wasn't covered. There was no foil over it.
And I don't live that far away, and it's like a 3-minute drive.
That's a disaster waiting to happen.
Well, it's only spilled once before.
Yes. And you kept doing it.
Here's the real problem.
Okay.
Here's what happens is I make my breakfast. I eat eggs and bacon every day. I'm not going to eat a burrito or a donut every day.
Okay. I'm using those as examples.
So I'm not I'm saying there's handheld breakfast items that are unhealthy. And so that's why I have eggs and bacon. And I make it on a plate with a fork. And then I realize I don't have time to finish it. So what are my options? I could dirty up another container. I could not eat it. I could scarf it down. Well, all of those are less than ideal. So I'll just carry it in the car. And it forces me to slow down.
Oh, I bet.
So I just have to take a little bit of a more measured approach to driving and walking through the hallway. I think it's quite fine.
Do you get any weird looks as you get on the elevator with a plate of eggs and bacon?
Most of the time, yes. Yeah, but I think they're jealous because they had their donuts and their Frosted Flakes.
Fair enough.
They wish they had nice pasture-raised eggs and bacon from the farmer's market, which is what I had.
Okay.
So thank you very much. That's really a meal you can only have at home, at a diner. Like you can't, it's not a good camping meal.
No.
Speaking of camping meals, our guest today had camping meals for 4 years straight. Charlie Walker is a British adventurer, explorer, writer, and public speaker. He has done some of the most absolutely absurdly impressive journeys that you can imagine. He's explored the Congo River. He's hiked through the Siberian forest. He has traveled by bicycle to the furthest cape in Africa, Asia, and Europe, all the way back to his home in London. He's done some really long, arduous journeys, and he has a lot of stories from those journeys. He has a lot of wisdom from those journeys too. So whether you're a very amateur adventurer in the comparison to Charlie, like Sean and I might consider ourselves to be, or you're not an adventurer at all, you're just a business owner who's looking to consume the wisdom of people who have done incredible things unrelated to business, this episode is right up your alley. Charlie Walker's got some great stories, some great wisdom. I'm Sanger Smith with my dad, Sean Smith. This is Decidedly. You're insane, dude. Yeah, like
I could take that one of two ways.
Here's the thing. People called me insane for doing like a single Ironman triathlon. A bunch of my friends, dude, you're crazy. What's wrong with you? Why would you want to do that? In the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, that's not like that crazy. And then Charlie's over here, 40,000 miles on a bike, going all over the world, walking everywhere, biking everywhere. Like, yeah, there's a different level to pushing the body and pushing the mind to how far can you go.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would slightly put some context to that comment in that, I mean, for example, I've never done an Ironman, and I should think that if I had 27 spare hours, I could probably limp my way through one at some impossibly slow pace. You could get it done in 27.
I'm
sure I could, but I couldn't do one particularly fast. I've never been in any sense a sort of performance athlete. I'm much more someone who likes to do long things slowly, and I guess the struggle there is often more about the mental struggle than the physical struggle. And I suppose it just depends on how committed you are to what you want to do and how willing you are to suffer for it, along with the highs that are thrown in with that. So, I personally think people who do Ironman are insane. So, we're at an impasse. I just like to do things kind of slow and steady at my own pace. I've never been particularly a physical specimen. I kind of stand by saying that I think the majority of people, able-bodied or even not fully able-bodied, could probably do most of the things I have done, should they choose to. But choosing to is perhaps the bigger barrier.
Did you work your way up to that, like, starting to do, kind of weekend hikes and little hikes around the neighborhood, going out to a national park and things like that? Or did you just one day wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to bike across the Congo or something like that? How did that evolve?
There wasn't that much of a sort of a learning curve running into it. I guess I am a bit rash in my decisions quite often, but so I went on a couple of bike rides when I was on my summer out from having just finished university or college. I took a bicycle to Beijing and cycled to Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of Mongolia, and it was only about 1,000 miles or 1,600 k, and only took a couple of weeks. And truth be told, I didn't really enjoy it. It was really hot. There was about 400 miles with no roads, just kind of loose sand tracks across the desert. I not tore, but snapped a muscle in my leg about 10 days before flying out. I then broke my wrist the day I arrived in Beijing. The fact that I can't entirely remember how that happened gives you some idea as to how that happened. So I wasn't necessarily physically in the best shape when I actually set off on my bike. The night before I set off,
that didn't stop you from like tearing your muscle and breaking your wrist, and you're like, I'll still do this. That seems like a good idea.
My dad kind of gave me a lift to the airport, and I left the crutches with him and kind of hobbled on through. And I had a friend in Beijing to stay with, so I had somewhere to kind of recover for another couple of weeks before I actually started cycling. And then the night before
Charlie,
I set off,
I gotta say, of course you didn't like it.
It sounds miserable.
You could have told me before this.
I'll qualify that comment in a minute, but the night before I set off on the bike, I got a hacksaw and cut the plaster cast off my wrist and bandaged it up and cycled off. And I didn't much love it. And it was quite in at the deep end for cycle touring. You'd be better off cycling on a known trail rather than on sort of small, dangerous roads through rural North China and then on into a desert in midsummer as well. But by the time I arrived in Ulaanbaatar, I think I had got some sense of what cycle touring could offer, should you choose to do it in a slightly less kind of penitential geography. And there was one night, a couple of weeks after I'd finished that ride, I stayed out in Mongolia for a bit. I'd planned to fly back from Mongolia, but some friends of mine arrived in Mongolia having driven a car from London to Mongolia, part of this annual event called the Mongol Rally, where the cars get donated to a charity at the far end and sort of auctioned and sold off, and the money goes to a charity. But their car, which was a 1997 Ford Escort, which had just been battered across about 12 countries, including huge, long, roadless tracts in Central Asia, for 10,000 miles. Their car was rejected by the charity. They said, we don't want it. We can't sell this or anything. And they had all booked tickets on the Trans-Siberian Express to head all the way back to Moscow and then fly home from there. And I got a little bit tipsy with them one night and sort of said, yeah, I'll drive it home. Sure, if you guys cover the petrol. And yeah, I spent 2 weeks driving this car home. And then one night I picked up a couple of people along the way. One night in this forest in Siberia, we were sat around a little campfire under the stars. And I got quite drunk on Genghis Khan black vodka. It is not black colored; it's clear liquid. That's just it's a bit like your Johnny Walker Black. There's different levels of terribleness when it comes to Genghis Khan vodka. But I suddenly sort of decided, yeah, cycling, I'll do that. For a long time. And the next morning I woke up and I'd drawn these very crude lines across the tiny world map that's in the back of a Lonely Planet, just to illustrate time zones. And I had sketched these big, bold lines across continents. And then I thought, yeah, that's not a bad idea. So about a year later, I set off and there was very little cycling in that year in between. I didn't particularly train for it. I spent time kind of, getting the money together and thinking about, where I wanted to go, but I didn't really plan things in depth. And I think probably by the time I set off, the furthest I'd cycled in a day for the last year was about 30 miles. Day one was 100 miles through hilly terrain in southern England. So yeah, I really did sort of launch myself into it. That was a really long answer to your pithy question about 15 minutes ago. But yeah, that's how I got started.
So you set a course on each continent. You went across Africa, or like from Cape Town up?
Furthest Cape of all three, yeah.
That was the final, exactly, yeah. So Cape Town up the west side of Africa was the final leg. The concept of the journey was to get from home in the UK back to home via the furthest away point geographically on each of Europe, Asia, and Africa. So up to the top of Europe, down to the southeast of Asia, to Singapore, and then up around down to the bottom of Africa and back up the other side. Which I took pretty wiggly routes.
There's a shorter way, dude.
Well, yeah. But, I had what some might call, what critics might call a 4-year holiday at the cost of only £12,000. So, the length and the affordability.
You lived on £12,000 for over 4 years?
Yes, this was starting in 2010. So obviously, inflate that adjust that for inflation, and it would be a bit more than that today. But yeah, I lived in a tent for the vast majority of those 4.5 years, as it was. And, bought food in local markets and, cooked on a little stove. And yeah, I was living, at times I was living off $1 or $2 a day. There were some places I visited that were so mind-blowingly friendly, Iran in particular, where it was almost impossible to buy food. People would just force food on me at all times, or force hospitality on me, take me into their home. Strangers on the side of the road or strangers driving down the road would pull over and then just insist that I came and spent the night with them. And so, yeah, there were certain parts of the trip where, well, let's put it this way. I crossed Iran twice on this journey. And the first time I passed through, I was there for just 1 month and cycled 1,200 miles, which was exclusively mountain and desert. So, yeah, quite hard work, still quite warm at that time of year. And I came out the other side after 1 month heavier than when I entered. So sort of profuse was the hospitality. It's really hard to keep your weight up when you're cycling.
Yeah, when you're cycling that much. The skinniest I ever was in my life was when I was riding my bike all the time.
Yeah, no, it's definitely it's good exercise. I look back occasionally at the pictures from that time and sort of look enviously at the slightly slighter being I used to be.
Did you ever have any of the opposite experiences? Because the area you went through on the western side of Africa, those are some rough areas.
Yeah, West Africa is quite a challenging place. I didn't have any particular bad encounters there. And, throughout the whole journey and throughout the 60 plus countries it took me through, I'd say 99.9% 5% of human encounters were just overwhelmingly positive. It does seem there is a kind of pretty much a global human default towards kind of kindness or nurturing. There was the odd occasion. There was one night in a village in Ethiopia where a mob of a couple hundred people beat me up for a few minutes, which wasn't much fun. There's kind of context to that,
what was the reasoning?
Well, you know how England has a bit of a global reputation for football hooliganism. Turns out it's a global phenomenon, or at least an international phenomenon. I was cycling through a region in the southwest of the country, and my kind of usual rule of thumb each evening was to, when camping, get off the road unseen, hide somewhere. Essentially stealth camping. I think nowadays people call it wild camping, but I've always just called it camping because there aren't many campsites in most parts of the world. But I'd sneak off, hide behind a bush, or get into the forest or whatever. Get myself hidden because I don't know if I'm trespassing. I don't know whose land I'm on. I know I'm not going to cause any trouble, make any mess, leave any mess, start any bushfires or whatever. But even so, it's not my land, it's not my place. So I kept a low profile. But this particular evening in Ethiopia, there were just people on the road everywhere. And villages tend to be, in many parts of the sort of global south, villages tend to be strung along roads, and settlements sort of build up along roads and stretch out along roads because that's the artery, the highway. And there was just no breaks in the people, all on the road, celebrating, dancing, because their local team, which I believe was based in a town called Soto, I'm trying to remember now. But their local team had just won a football game and been promoted to the next league, which was a huge deal. But the crowds of people just kept building and building, and there was no break in the people in which I could just nip off the road and hide. And night fell, and it was coincidentally that night it was a full moon, and one of those every now and again the moon comes up red, a blood moon they call it. And also every now and again you get a super moon because the moon has a slightly elliptical orbit, so it's that bit closer to Earth, so it looked bigger and brighter. So this was a super blood moon that night, and this huge red moon just kind of rose ominously above the mountains to the east of where I was, and there was just a sort of carnival sense of chaos and frenzy in the air. And it seemed generally everyone was kind of celebrating and having a good time. But then when I arrived in one village, there was just a knot of people blocking the road. And my best guess is a couple hundred people. And I just tried to kind of slip through them. I dismounted from my bike, tried to walk it through people. And then suddenly at some point, someone shouted something in Amharic, which I don't speak, of course. And 2 seconds later, the crowd became a mob and just turned on me. And it was the thing that was particularly bizarre. It was men, women, and children. It was just a total sort of manic frenzy. And I think it probably worked in my favor that there were quite as many people as there were, because it was tightly packed and people were kind of almost fighting with each other to get at me. I don't have any real good explanation for this. I guess, sort of mob mentality, crowd frenzies, they can happen anywhere, anytime. And if you're unlucky, you're unlucky. Obviously, I stood out being not just, different ethnicity, but a foreigner on a bicycle, which is quite a conspicuous means of transport. No one rides bikes in Ethiopia, which is very unusual in sub-Saharan Africa. People ride bikes all over the place. It's the kind of the global means of transport. But in the local language in Ethiopia, the word for bicycle, or the phrase for bicycle, is Yashaitan Ferus, which means iron devil. So there's maybe something about bikes people don't like. I don't know. Either way, the upshot was quite a few cuts and bruises, and a sort of eventually having managed to kind of fight my way out and get away, a half-hour sob in my tent in the dark, a little way on down the road when I did find somewhere to disappear. So not a great night, but that is the exception, not the rule.
Did you make it through that with your bike and your stuff?
Yeah, no, actually everything was kind of intact.
Okay. They just wanted to beat the shit out of you.
Yeah. One of my paddle panniers or saddlebags had been opened, but then the sort of drawstring inside it hadn't been opened. And I rode away under a hail of stones and shoes and sticks. But yeah, did get away.
Wow. Did you have any injuries?
Cuts and bruises, but thankfully nothing more serious than that. But it did take me a few days after that, I guess, to kind of slightly shake off the funk that gave me, which I guess is pretty normal.
Yeah, I would imagine it would take most people a lot longer than a few days.
Yeah, well, there's something about being off on a journey, on an expedition, where you can't really, while continuing what you're doing, necessarily wallow in these things too much, because you've got the daily necessities that take up quite a lot of headspace. You know, each day you don't know where you're going to sleep that night. You don't know where you're going to get food from that day. So you just got to be kind of getting on with it. You know, you do have bouts when you're in the saddle where you've got, you know, freedom and space to think. And that's one of the great sort of privileges, one of the great luxuries of a long bike ride, as I'm sure you know. If you get too kind of bogged down with any particular negativity, you're just not going to be able to carry on. And so I think it's probably pragmatically, I just put it out of mind pretty soon and got on with it.
What I love about riding bikes for a long period is you almost have to meditate. So to pass the time, there were all types of things that I would recite to myself. Is you can only have like free flowing thoughts for so long. And then at some point it's like, I have been thinking for 7 hours. I want to just like not think. So the only way to not think would be to meditate. And the only way to meditate would be because you can't close your eyes and om for, more than a second while you're on a bike. Yeah. So I would like recite a poem that I had memorized, 20 times in a row, or recite a prayer 20 times in a row, or do something that I could just keep my mind going without thinking. And that was like wonderful, because how often do I have an hour where I could just pray for an hour? Very, very rarely do I have that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I never actually developed a sort of a particular technique for that as you have, which perhaps I should have. But I would, occasionally or semi-regularly kind of attain that state. I used to refer to it as, blissful brainlessness, where you're cycling along and suddenly, 2 hours have gone and you haven't really noticed that time passing, and you're still a passenger in some sense. You're still, I guess, there to swerve, to steer, to keep, you still got a vague awareness about the sound of a car rushing up too quickly behind you or too close or whatever it might be. And usually the thing that snaps you out of these kind of reveries is a vehicle passing very close. I can totally relate to that. I found that one of the sort of great joys of that trip was just occasionally when you just time slips away painlessly, peacefully, and you're another 40 miles further down the road or whatever it might be. And that's it almost feels like cheating.
Yeah, there's something so rewarding about having the immediate accomplishment of a goal available to you at all times. And like the larger goal, of course, was always, until the very, very end, extraordinarily far away for you. You had this ultimate goal that you were aiming at that was going to take you a long time. You can't focus when you're on Ethiopia about arriving in London. I mean, you can remind yourself of that goal, but thinking about it every hour, every second, that's going to be demoralizing. So I imagine that you set these much shorter, much achievable goals. I heard there was a town up there. Let me get to that town. Or, just 3 more hours and then I can go to sleep, or whatever. You set like a smaller goal. And whether you're doing a long hike like Sean did on the PCT or the Camino, or you're doing an Ironman, it was, okay, let me get to mile 60. Like, I'll feel so good when I get to mile 60. Then you get to mile 60, you're like, let me get to mile 70, And
it's a sequence of short goals.
Of short goals.
Yeah, that's I think probably the most broadly applicable thing I took away from that first big journey was, and I mean this is relevant to kind of every aspect of life, I think, and business, is being able to break things down and being able to focus on the small goals when that's what's needed, and then to focus on the big goals when that's what's needed. Yeah, I mean, do you guys also have the phrase to not be able to see the woods for the trees?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's kind of like choosing whether you're seeing the woods or the trees at any different time. So I kind of like to think of it as mental zoom. You know, whenever the big picture seems too much, it's too overwhelming, and you just kind of refocus your mental zoom and zoom in on the small picture and like, right, I just need to get to the next city or a camp spot for tonight, or, you know, whatever it might be. And then at times when you're, you know, kind of bogged down by the small picture, something that springs to mind was when the monsoon rains arrived and I was in the sort of depths of Central Africa on mud-choked roads where I had to carry my bike for about, well, a day and a half. But it wasn't just carrying my bike. I had too much stuff to carry. So I would have to walk with my bike for, let's say, a mile, hide it in a bush, walk back, pick up 2 of my 4 bags, carry them, hide them in a bush, and then walk back and pick up the other 2. And yeah, so 5 miles back and forth for every 1 mile actually advancing. And when you're doing that, you cannot focus on the smaller goal necessarily because the smaller goal is demoralizing. But while I was doing that, that's when I allowed myself to kind of, you know, think about the big picture and think, you know, this is a huge undertaking, and this is not good right now. I'm not really having a good time, but I wouldn't want to throw away this huge thing that I've been working towards for the last 3.5 years by this point, just because I'm having a couple of bad days now. That wouldn't really make sense. So I guess, yeah, just trying to kind of shift your perspective back and forth as and when it's convenient is a tool or a handy bit of self-deceit maybe, but a distraction nevertheless.
So whenever you're going on this journey, you obviously couldn't plan out ahead of time. Okay, day 57, I'm going to ride 100 miles and I'm going to sleep in this little town and I'm going to do a pit stop here to get some food. You can't do that, right? You might have, I imagine, had very general checkpoints in your mind, but you couldn't have micromanaged the day-to-day sustenance planning. Sean, when he did the Pacific Crest Trail, he had some more ability to do some of the like checkpoint planning because it's a really well supported trail. You're still way out there in the middle of nothing, but there's places where you could be aware, okay, there's a water cache hidden in the bushes up here in the middle of the desert. So if I can make it to there, I can get more water. Or there's a little town
2 days ahead. Yeah, I can. Yeah.
So when you're doing this, how often did you find yourself in a real like crisis of unpreparedness that you wouldn't have been able to know about? Like, okay, hey, I think in 10 miles there's a town, and then you get there and you're like, there is no town and I need water and I need food.
I suspect if you asked me that question, or rather, if you asked the me who hadn't yet been on that trip the same question compared to me having now been on that trip, we'd probably have quite different answers, in that what seemed like a problem or a catastrophe back then no longer really would to me, because I think you get better at kind of rolling with the punches, for want of a better phrase. For starters, when you're cycling, I wasn't trail biking, I was on roads. So the majority of the time, I wasn't going necessarily that long between human settlements. So that kind of makes things easier in some sense. I've had other journeys since then where I've gone for much longer, a month between human settlements. And that's presents more of a challenge or just more logistical or preparation, checklists. But on the occasions where I did have a long, I crossed the Sahara twice. There's even in the Sahara, there's not that many vehicles even on the roads. It's pretty empty. And there was one stretch where I think to save myself a extra 300 miles. Cycling in the Sahara is sort of awe-inspiring and majestic, but also just really hot and hard, and you don't really want to necessarily elongate the journey at places like that. So instead of an extra about 300 miles on the loop on the good road, I decided to take the old disused road, which was just dirt tracks, which was more direct, but it meant that there would be about 2 days between places where I could get any water. And so I set off with, I think, 24 or 22 liters of water, which weighs you down a lot. And that just ran down incredibly quickly, but not to the point of disaster, just to the point where I had to be really hard on myself and ration myself. and, slowly dehydrate. But, I was sort of, I suppose, vaguely aware of what I was feeling and what I was experiencing. And there's that kind of precipice where you go from discomfort or difficulty to disaster. And I suppose the more you push and stretch and stress yourself, the more you are aware of where that precipice actually is. Because before the discomfort and difficulty, there's just this long, gentle slope down from comfort and ease. And the further you go down it, the more it feels like you're at the precipice. But the more times that you've been closer to where the actual precipice might be, the longer away it is. The more times you struggle, the more times the better you know how able you are to struggle and what your limits are. And so because I had fairly easy run into this trip, 3 months through Europe in summer, where there were long stretches in Scandinavia between settlements, but nothing too bad. I suppose I sort of slowly built up an awareness of what I was capable of, what I was able to sort of put up with, how much or how little food and water I was able to survive on for a stretch of time. So by the time it got to the bigger, more dangerous places, Tibet in winter, the Gobi in summer, the Sahara in summer, I was, I suppose, much better able to cope with the difficulty, the discomfort, and know that the disaster was actually still quite a way off. And that's definitely been helpful with various other expeditions since that first big trip.
So one of your more recent expeditions, you hiked through Siberia. I wanted to hear about that.
So that was a couple of years ago. I set off in sort of mid-February 2022, which the eagle-eared listeners will realize is not the best time to fly to Russia, as it turned out historically. So I flew into a region called Yakutia, or Sakha Republic.
So were you there right before the invasion or right after, or how was that placed?
No, yeah, I arrived a few days before.
Okay.
And so now, with hindsight, it seems like madness to have gone at all. But it's kind of quite easily forgotten now that back then, pretty much everyone, most of the media, most Russian watchers, most observers, seemed to think that nothing was going to happen, despite this huge massing of troops along the Ukrainian border throughout Belarus and Russia. About 190,000 troops, I believe, by the time I flew in. Most people thought this was just some sort of strategic play from Putin, the wily master strategist, to kind of build a stronger platform from which to demand concessions from NATO or non-expansion agreements or whatever it might be. The people who didn't think that, the people who did say, yes, an invasion is going to happen, included not really any or many Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government, but US intelligence and UK intelligence. Actually, I think the Five Eyes intelligence partnership said, we have every reason to believe an invasion is coming. But all the media I was reading and everyone else was reading said, no, this isn't going to happen. Anyway, I flew in. The invasion did begin. The journey was a 600-mile hike along the surface of a frozen river in far northeast Russia. So if you go to Beijing and go about 2,000 miles north and about another 1,000 miles east up in the Arctic Circle, that's where I was. So we're talking...
600 miles doesn't sound that far until you say it's on a frozen river in Siberia. And then you go, that's going to be miserable.
I mean, having been to that sort of those sort of places now, I mean, Siberia has been known as the world's largest natural prison for a couple hundred years. It's where the Soviets and before them the Tsarists dumped their dissidents and their unwanted and their criminals for a long, long time. And the reason is, once you're out there, there's no realistic escape. Of course, I was there by choice. I wasn't a political dissident or an exile. So I walked for 600 miles along this river, and about once a week I went through a settlement. These were indigenous Siberian peoples, the Sakha people, the Evenki people, reindeer herders, pony breeders, ice fishermen. And so once a week I'd pass through a settlement, spend the night, get to know people. And I just generally got this kind of rising sense of unease, and I noticed this kind of rising sense of paranoia within the communities I was going through as gradually the censorship ratcheted up. The word war was essentially outlawed. Just the whole atmosphere of the country changed, even in this far off place. I was closer to Vancouver than Moscow, twice as close to the North Pole as Moscow or Kyiv. I was about 3,500 miles from either of those cities. But gradually I just noticed things, people got more and more sort of, reticent or taciturn around me, more and more on edge when talking to me. And when I finally did get to the end of this hike, and I mean, the hike was quite brutal. It was in temperatures down to, like, I camped in minus 50 degrees Celsius, so Fahrenheit. I don't know what that would be, about minus 493 point B. I don't know how the Fahrenheit system works. But yeah,
no one
really
does.
Temperatures. They don't convert nicely.
No.
Yeah, let's say it was about 300 Kelvin. Who knows? I just got to the end of this hike and thought I'd done the hard bit. But on arrival in this port town on the north coast, on the Arctic coast, my finishing line, I was quickly arrested and then taken to court and locked up for what turned out to be a month, with very little, with no idea of how long I would be there or when I would be released. I was told that you will be deported, but we don't know when. So
how did that happen?
Yeah, what were they saying? What was the reason for the arrest?
Well, I will tell you, but firstly, it doesn't really matter in Russia. In that, if you are taken,
of course,
the current conviction rate of cases that go to court in Russia is 99.7%, 99.75%. So 1 in 400 people are acquitted. I was accused of conducting illegal journalism, asking provocative questions about the special military operation in Ukraine, and photographing restricted military sites.
Did you have a sense it was coming, or was it just out of the blue? They just show up at your door and knock on it and take you away?
Yeah, they did just show up at my door out of the blue. But I had already been interviewed by the FSB a couple of times by this point. The FSB is one of the sort of descendants of the KGB. I had a sort of a slapped wrist and a small fine in one settlement I passed through about a month earlier. And yeah, it didn't surprise me to receive some further attention from the authorities. It did surprise me that it escalated to where it did. I'm also aware that, having thankfully finally been deported after that 1 month, I remain incredibly lucky to not have ended up there until, for instance, just last month, when Evan Gershkovich and Karamazov and various other people were traded in that huge, 24 prisoners traded. I think had I been potentially closer to Moscow as opposed to so far out, kind of in the sticks, or had it been a little later in the war, or had some particular bod at the police or the KGB decided opportunistically to escalate my case, then I think there's a very good chance I could have been held onto as sort of fodder for prisoner exchange. Brittany Griner was still locked up while I was there, which I didn't know about her. I had very little access to any kind of outside world news or media while I was A, hiking, and B, incarcerated. So yeah, I think I got sort of incredibly lucky in some sense to be able to get out and tell the story. But that was an unexpected end to a recent journey.
Like you said earlier, I mean, looking at it now and with the state of the war, and having heard all of these other stories of prisoners held unjustly there, I mean, going today to go do the hike through Siberia, we would look at you and say, okay, obviously you're crazy. But at the time, how aware were you if at all, of the risk of potential imprisonment?
I didn't think that would happen. I mean, I'm aware that as a I was about to say a foreigner, but really as a Westerner in Russian, you face different risks to people from other countries, and indeed to local people who live under very tight strictures as well. I had traveled in Russia a fair bit before. I speak some Russian, I had been taken to court in Russia a couple of times before for petty minor things that sort of, kayaking down a stretch of river that happened to constitute a small section of the border between Russia and Kazakhstan, and that's just off limits, but there's no information about that. Little things like that. They shouldn't, that weren't particularly serious, but you're taken to court, everyone's very stern, they question you for 5 hours, and then they slap you with a $12 fine or whatever it might be, tiny administrative offenses. So, I wasn't, I wouldn't have been surprised to have had contact with the police or the FSB, and to have some sort of trouble, maybe to be taken to court at some point to face a fine. This was not totally unexpected, but the sudden start of this new now 2.5-year-old war that has in so many ways changed the world, along with various other conflicts going on at the moment. It was just a new reality we were living in, and Russia changed dramatically particularly the first few weeks, particularly the first 2 weeks of the war, where suddenly all independent, all opposition media was shut down. People started getting arrested for, I think,
calling it a war, probably.
Well, exactly, yes. And in the first 7 days of the war, on average, 1,000 protesters were arrested each day for saying we don't want war, which is unthinkable in your country or my country. But in Russia, that is not a freedom people have anymore. There was one girl, reportedly young woman or schoolgirl, I forget which, reportedly arrested in Yakutsk, which is the capital city of the Sakha Republic, or Yakutsk, Yakutia, this region I was in. And she was arrested because her backpack or school bag, which was just some cheap product made in China, had the word peace in English embroidered on it. And that was deemed provocative, or, so it was just a changed country. Russia has always been quite a autocratic place, but during that, those initial few weeks, and still more so in the 2.5 years since, it took a major lurch towards, I wouldn't say it is yet a totally totalitarian state, but it's certainly moved a big distance in that direction.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's for sure. When you were imprisoned there in Russia, was it a day-to-day, hey, maybe I'm going to get out today, or I wonder what's happening today, or did they lay it out and say, you're going to be in prison for a month and we're letting you out in August or whatever?
Oh, I wish they'd told me that. The hardest thing about being in there was the fact that I was counting the days up rather than counting the days down. And so when I first got in, they said, maybe a few days. And after a few days, they said, it could be a few weeks. And after a couple of weeks, they said, this could be months. We don't know. And so, I kind of worried that if I ended up being there a couple of months, it seemed, almost inevitable that this case would just get across someone else's desk, and my situation escalates. So the fact that essentially I was in a prison for foreign citizens. So the other people in this prison were largely Kazakhs, Uzbeks. There was a Ukrainian. There were a couple of Chinese people. And every now and again, they just get around to organizing a deportation. It's a very bureaucratic process. There is no country more bureaucratic than Russia. Whenever I get into trouble with the police there in the past, and there's paperwork, they'll make you sign everything in triplicate or quadruplicate. And they'll have some sheath of 30 pages, and you'll have to sign your name on each page 3 or 4 times. It's unbelievably bureaucratic. And just the process of deporting people can take a long, long time. I found out when I was being deported from one of the bailiffs who escorted me on the flight from Yakutsk, where I was held, to Moscow before a flight out of the country. I was in handcuffs on the seat next to this guy, and we got chatting. And he said, the next deportation run isn't due to be for about another 3 months. And you were, only just managed to get included on this one. So had I arrived a couple of days later and the paperwork been a little bit more held up, then there's a good chance I would have been there through the summer, potentially for up to 3 or 4 months. And then who knows how much longer after that.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a lucky miss.
Since they had you, thank goodness they let you go. I mean, that's a good thing. But since they had you, what do you think caused them to let you go? And like, why not keep you as a bargaining chip for a long time, like a Brittany Griner, and trade you for somebody that they want?
That's a good question. I can only really speculate. They tried me for administrative offences rather than criminal offences, for which there is not sort of technically a custodial sentence. It's the potential upshots of that are fines and deportation and banning from the country. I've had all three of those now. I'm currently not allowed to Russia, but they do hold on to you until deportation. There are two types of deportation. There's one where you're just left to your own devices and you get yourself out the country. And so it just didn't get escalated to that point. But after 2 weeks locked up, I was suddenly taken out of my cell and taken back to the courthouse. I'd managed through a local friend to hire a lawyer to appeal the court's decision. And when I came before this judge, who didn't give me more than about 90 seconds hearing, he said, you go back to the prison. I was appealing just to be able to deport myself. So to save the state the budget of deporting me, I was happy to buy my own flights and get myself out of the country. And he said, no, because the nature of your crimes is political. You must go back. So it seems like I was on that very fine line between, sort of a pesky misdemeanor and potentially something much more serious. But I mean, the legal system there is A, dense, but B, riddled with vagary, and I think they're happy to let things lie in a kind of blurred area until they figure out what exactly they want to do with you.
Now they, like you said earlier, it doesn't really matter what you did, whether you did what they accused you of or anything like that. But they accused you of illegal journalism and asking provocative questions about the war.
Mm-hmm.
Or were you doing anything that could even remotely be misinterpreted as that, or were you just walking through the woods?
A fair question, and I suppose, I mean, I did once work briefly for a newspaper many years ago, but I'm not and don't consider myself a journalist. I consider myself a travel writer or adventure travel writer or explorer, if I want to be hyperbolic. And so I don't consider myself a journalist, and I don't consider travel writing journalism. It's it's reportage, I guess. But I went out there not knowing there was going to be a war, with a view to meeting, learning about, and documenting the kind of the remote living communities up in this very far flung corner of the Eurasian continent. I was very scrupulously careful not to bring up the situation in Ukraine when I met people. But as it turned out, the vast majority of people I did meet would ask me about that almost immediately after pleasantries. Hello, how are you? Do you have enough to eat? This would potentially be, someone in a village I passed through. They would immediately say, so what do you think about the special operation? And I also kind of adopted a stance of, I guess, what I would call tactical ambiguity. And I would merely say, I'm very sad there's a war. I'm also aware that the situation in the media in my country and the situation in the media in this country are very different. So I don't know what to believe. Who knows what's going on? Which more or less tallied with a lot of what quite a few people would, I think, also tactically ambiguously say out there, because everyone was very guarded about what they said about the situation. When people were one-on-one, which is a situation I found myself in with people less often than with groups, but one-on-one, there were quite a number of people who confided to me that they were horrified by what was going on. They felt ashamed to be Russian at that time. They felt disgusted by the needless slaughter of people from both countries.
Wow.
Russians and Ukrainians historically sort of think of themselves as erstwhile siblings or cousins. They are very close historically. But not the same, I hasten to add. So yeah, I was very careful not to do what I was accused of.
It's amazing that in a country with such a grasp on the media and a grasp on the freedoms and the liberties of their people, even the people in the remote areas of that country are capable of arriving at the quote unquote wrong conclusion, the one the government does not want them to have. That's actually somewhat encouraging, I would say. Because I would expect in rural Russia, people would go, oh, yeah, it's
You're gonna
awesome.
eat the propaganda.
Yeah, it's great. That's all I've been allowed to think.
Yeah, I mean, the opinions I encountered ran the gamut from just kind of, rabid nationalism, like aggressive, militant nationalism, all the way to just outright objection. But the only real constant in, interactions I had with people was the sense of unease discussing it. And, there's not much access to what's going on, to the truth of what's going on inside Russia. But there is some sense, and there are Telegram groups, and there is information out there, but it's a very, very muddied information scape, and the media is so clouded by just false stories. I think the kind of the term for the technique the Kremlin is using in politics is flooding the zone with shit. So just put all this crap out there, all this rubbish, bollocks, things that aren't true, things that are true, things that are exaggerations, things that are diminishments, and then people just don't know what to believe. But there are very few people who feel entirely comfortable with knowing lots and lots and lots of people are dying. That said, quite a number of people do seem to genuinely believe the false stories of neo-Nazism, at the heart of Ukrainian, civil life and government that the Kremlin had been putting out for, about 8 years. But about 8 years by that point, since the invasion of Crimea. And also there is a century of propaganda, disinformation, and just fear in that country, more than a century now. The Soviet era was a very fascinating and strange time for information in the USSR, and there's still, I think, a held cultural memory of not speaking out, of being guarded, because people were for many years taken away in the night.
Wow. So that whole experience would be what I would call a transformative experience. What was your most surprising learning through all of that?
I think the thing that stood out most to me by the end of it was the difficulty of enforced isolation. I had, prior to my arrest, I had just spent 2 months living outdoors in some of the most inhospitable conditions that you can drum up. Getting mild, frostbite, and losing huge amounts of weight, and putting myself through the ringer quite a bit, and that was fine, and I enjoyed it because it was voluntary, and I spent a lot of time by myself. I sometimes would go days without seeing anyone or talking to anyone. I think 10 days was the longest at one point, and I loved it. It was serene, it was beautiful, it was cold. There were stunning, auroras folding and playing across the night sky, which I wouldn't watch for long because it was obviously far too cold to stay outside. But, that was fine. And then as soon as I was forced to be locked up somewhere and the choice, my agency was taken away, that's what I found particularly hard. And that, I wouldn't have expected that. I would have expected the sheer fear of the experience, the surly guards hissing spy at me through the door, the terrible meals, the cameras in the ceiling watching my every move, being in a cell for 24 hours around the clock, day after day after day. I thought that would be the struggle, but it was being alone. For 2 weeks, I shared a cell with 2 other inmates. And then for the second half of my time there, I was in a cell by myself. And, I got better at it. I got used to it, and I don't mind being alone, but it was the enforcement of it that I found particularly shocking.
Oh. What would you say is your biggest decision-making tip for business owners?
I reckon, I suppose I deal a lot with risk and risk aversion and not risk aversion, decision-making in that sense. And I think, there are, in finance and investment, for example, there are various methods, questionnaires, etc., for figuring out your risk appetite. And I would say to people, figure out what your risk appetite is in whatever aspect of business it is that you are dealing with at any given time. And then if it comes out especially high, or if you have a sense of it being especially high, then try to just sort of rein it back a bit. But more importantly, the converse of that, which is if you do have quite a low risk appetite, just try and push a little bit further, because the right place is always going to probably be somewhere in the middle. And it's kind of all too easy to just follow your first instinct on risk, which is not necessarily going to be right. Our instincts are useful, but they are guided by many different biases that we struggle to control.
Thanks, Charlie. Where can people connect with you?
People can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, X, I guess. That's at CW Explore. My website is cwexplore.com. I've written a couple of books, Through Sand and Snow and On Road to the Echo. People can find those on Amazon, Audible, bookshops out there. And I'm working on a book about Russia at the moment, about Siberia. So watch this space for that. But those are the best places to check out what I do.
I'm looking forward to that one. Thanks, Charlie.
Hey, thanks for talking to us, Charlie.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was fascinating talking to Charlie. It's just amazing the stuff he can do. My takeaway from talking with him, there was a lot, but I finished our conversation with a sense around sort of grabbing hold of your own mental frameworks and the way that you approach events are going to happen. So calibrating sort of a predetermination of what you think your risk is going to be, pre-calibrating how you're going to deal with isolation, whether it's true isolation, being alone, but even just as a business owner, we sort of feel like we're on an island and alone sometimes, and just being prepared to deal with that. And he made an interesting comment around the more you sort of press into those stressful times, sort of, he called it the precipice. The more you do that, the more you realize where the actual layer is, or the level is that you don't want to cross. And you get more comfortable sort of moving through uncertainty. You get more comfortable moving through those risks for the better. And so I thought I got a lot from just talking with him.
Yeah, my biggest takeaway was having the short goals to focus on so that you don't get overwhelmed by the main goal, but also not losing sight of the main goal. So don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't miss the trees for the forest either. You have to have both in order to achieve something great. And especially the bigger the goal is, like something that Charlie was working on, you have to have those smaller goals.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.